the Murad Code Project. The Murad Code Project is a global consultative initiative that aims to build a better community of practice with, for, and concerning survivors of systematic and conflict-related sexual violence. The project centers around the Murad Code, a global code of conduct that captures the minimum standards that everyone who gathers and uses information about sexual violence must uphold. The practitioners the code addresses include documenters, investigators, journalists, researchers, policymakers, human rights monitors, humanitarian workers, and many other actors. So it's wonderful that we have so many people from across these sectors joining us today. The Murad Code Project was established in response to frustrations that survivors have shared for many years about the harm they experience when they participate in unethical and ineffective interactions with people gathering their information. No matter how well-intentioned they may be, when people doing this work do not follow the minimum standards, they cause or further amplify harm to survivors. The resources being launched today were developed by the Institute for International Criminal Investigations, which is currently spearheading the Murad Code Project, in partnership with survivors and 7 survivor support organizations. These are Nadia's Initiative in Iraq, the Refugee Law Project in Uganda, Him Rights and the Story Kitchen in Nepal, the Mukwege Foundation, SEMA in Ukraine, Colombia, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, Medica Zenica in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Lawyers and Doctors for Human Rights in Syria. The phase of the project, or this phase of the project, is being supported by the Government of Canada's Global Affairs Canada. We hope that many of you will have already taken a look at the resources which were shared via email before today's event. We will also post the resources in the chat. In a moment, I will introduce our first speakers to tell you more. Before I do, I would like to acknowledge that the issues we will discuss today may trigger difficult emotions for some, so please look after yourself and step away from the session if you need to. Relatedly, when we open the floor to Q&A later, we ask that everyone please be respectful and considerate of others in the virtual room. With that being said, I will now introduce our first speaker, Nadine Tounassi. Nadine Tounassi is the head of survivor activism at Freedom from Torture, an organization that helps asylum seekers and refugees who have survived torture to recover and rebuild their lives in the UK. In 2019, she was appointed as a survivor champion by the UK government's Preventing Sexual Violence in Conflict initiative to help shape the UK's policy and programming in this area. She has been a contributor to the Murad Code Project since it was launched. Nadine participated in the consultations to develop, in our own words, the Survivor Perspectives resource, in which the Murad Code Project team spoke to survivors from all over the world to understand their experiences of documentation and other information gathering processes. Nadine, you have the floor for 10 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Freya. Before I begin, I want to express my gratitude to the IICC and everyone I had the privilege to work with for this work and the publications which have been instrumental in demonstrating a survivor-centered approach. The Survivor Perspective resource title, in our own words, offer an insight into how some survivors have experienced interview and interaction with people documenting sexual violence. including journalists, investigators, and many others. It was developed to complement the Murad Code. It reflects survivors' view on key challenges in these processes. While it does not represent all survivors, it highlights diverse experiences and aims to support more ethical, effective, and trust-based engagement with survivors. In Our Own Words compiles reflections from survivors worldwide about the experiences of sharing information about sexual violence. The code shared by survivors consulted for this resource can help policymakers, journalists, law enforcement, social workers, documenters by providing insight into what it feels like to survive sexual violence and entrust your painful information with someone who you would like to have your story. This publication shows what can happen when survivor-centered engagement is not applied. The resource is primarily informed by the experiences of 164 survivors from around the world who share how the sexual violence-related information was collected or used. And of the 164 survivors, 58 were consulted by the lead Murad Code project consultant between December 2020 and March 2022. Quotes from this consultation were selected because they reflected recurring theme, diverse perspective, and varied experiences or information gathering, documentation, and use. I know we have survivors who contributed to these resources on the call today, and the insight that everyone shared really enriched this document. I myself am very grateful that I also had the opportunity to take part and share my own experience. And if you are interested in learning how these resources were developed, you can read more in the methodology section of the resource. It was really an interesting effort to be part of, I want to say. So when you read about the resource, you will see the survivors have shared the information for different reasons. But what they have in common is they want to be treated with dignity, empathy, compassion, and have the agency respected. So some key themes have derived from survival, and we learned that, first of all, engagement is personal and contextual. Each survivor experience is unique, shaped by geography, culture, gender, and a personal journey. Survivors have different objectives when engaging with you, and not all experiences are shared or fully disclosed. Secondly, emotional and psychological impact. Sharing trauma can be stressful and re-traumatizing. Survivors reported feeling of fear, emotional strain, and disturbance to their sense of inner peace. Repeated interview or interaction with that sensitivity can amplify stress and reduce willingness to engage. The third recurring theme is control and consent are crucial. So when survivors want to retain agency over the narrative, including consent, confidentiality, and control over how the information is used. Being misrepresented or having story used without permissions undermine trust and re-traumatize survivors. Number 4 is about transparency and communication. Survivors want clarity about who they are speaking with, the purpose of the engagement, the duration, and how the information will be used. Proper preparation, communication, and culturally appropriate support, like interpreters, are essential. Number 5, dignity, respect, and trust. Addressing stigma, bias, and misunderstanding about sexual violence is critical to ensure survivors feel safe to share. So what are the practical implications for you? Engagement is more than a procedural task. It requires ethical, survivor-centered approach that avoid harm. Listening carefully, respecting consent, and maintaining confidentiality build trust and improve the quality of information collected. Poorly handled engagement can block disclosure, increase trauma, and silence survivors. And in conclusion, I would like to say this. In our own words, is a reminder that effective engagement with survival requires empathy, sensitivity, and respect for the agency. By learning from survivor experiences, you can approach your work safely, ethically, and effectively, ensuring the survivors are heard, respected, and supported. So I really want to encourage you to read this resource and share it widely. It is available in English and 7 other languages like Arabic, French, Bosnian, Spanish, Swahili, Nepali, and Ukrainian. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Nadine, for sharing the significance of this resource, why and how it was developed, and some of the key messages that it contains. We now turn to the next speaker, Joel Toscano. Joel Toscano is a sociology student and activist focused on defending the rights of victims of the armed conflict in Colombia, with special emphasis on sexual violence against men, a historically invisible issue. His work seeks to guarantee access to justice, comprehensive reparation, and non-repetition for these victims. He is the coordinator of the Men's Focus Group and the National Group of Victims of Sexual Violence, prompting their participation in transitional justice processes. Joel is one of the victim survivors who contributed to In Our Own Words. Joel, you have 8 minutes. You have the floor. Please go ahead.
Hola, muchas gracias. Quisiera que me confirmaran si me oyen, ¿me escuchan bien? Ok, perfecto. Quiero iniciar, digamos, mi intervención agradeciendo, por supuesto, al Instituto por esta invitación y inicialmente a la iniciativa Código Murad por permitir participar de la construcción de esta herramienta tan importante y tan linda para las víctimas. Quisiera rápidamente contar que me voy a enfocar o a dedicar en estos 8 minutos a hablar sobre 3 puntos que a mi modo de ver están desarrollados en el ejercicio del código Murad. Ahí. Aunque nuestras historias a lo largo del ejercicio, lo que fue
the exercise, in the construction of the Murad Code, are different. When the time comes to speak, our concerns, regardless of whether you are a male or female, the concerns are the same: confidentiality, control over what we share, how we're going to share it, and the role that we're going to have in that exercise, and certainly the informed consent. For us, for all of us, these 3 points: confidentiality, control of victims and survivors, informed consent, is not just theory or a list of best practices. nor a list of good practices. Simply, it's the result of what has allowed us to, when professionals, when researchers, when communicators interview us, it allows us to remain silent. Confidentiality is oftentimes presented as a technical, somewhat abstract principle. For those of us who have survived sexual violence, it is not that. The stigma is not something foreign, a foreign possibility. As victims and survivors, it's something we have already experienced. When we speak, we not only tell of an event, we also expose from a position of fragility our dignity and our relationships and even our safety. You could also say that way of being seen in society. In the case of many men in my country, there is an additional burden, which is the stigma and the taboo of what entails to speak about sexual violence and how to face or deal or how to explain this, how to get people to understand that a man has been violated by another man. And something that caught my attention and that I noted in one of the texts that you're going to see in the document, you're going to find this quote that I mentioned in the construction of the exercise, which is speaking as men brings about consequences, stigmatization. One of the greatest problems for men, even if you don't want to see it like that, it is a silent enemy that we carry, that men carry, not only in my country, but also worldwide. How will people see me, for example? How do I say that it wasn't my fault? Or even the questions of why didn't you defend yourself, for example? And it's not And it's not to exaggerate, simply it's the experience of what the practices have been not only in my country, but also in in other victims worldwide. The second issue that I think is important, and I'd like to share a number of experiences with you on this, is the control that we have as survivors when performing this exercise. The control, not simply control, also means that we have will and the right to decide when and where, if we want to be alone or with someone, when we want to talk, when we want to say, okay, I don't want to tell anything, I don't want to tell you anything else, I want to stop, I don't want to keep on speaking, and that our interlocutors understand that. And we have to say that, unfortunately, for survivors of all genders, trust is fragile. Many survivors, including myself, have lived through experiences where we tell our stories and nothing happens afterward. Organizations disappear with the information, they never come back, and you're left with the uncertainty as a survivor. And I'd like to be clear on this point on a number of things and experience. In Colombia in 2021, I led an exercise of submitting a report to the Special Jurisdiction for Peace, which is a model of justice that is created thanks to an agreement signed between the government and a guerrilla group. And to close, we received funding from international cooperators, but this funding did not consider our voices. That is, it didn't consider that the decision and the control. There were victims who wanted to speak directly. We wanted to be the ones who represented ourselves and not some professional or not some outside person selling the idea that we weren't prepared to go out in public or to tell our story. I can tell my story when and where I want. And that has hindered the effort in my country, for example, the situation where victims can speak publicly. In how these types of actions are managed. Lastly, I know that time is short, and let me know if I'm running out of time. Lastly, I'd like to talk about informed consent. That's why for us, informed consent is not a piece of paper that is signed to comply with a formality. It's not that, of course. It's a process before speaking where we need to know specific things. What is this going to be used for? What our stories are going to be used? Who is going to hear them? What is going to be published and what is not going to be published? What risks could arise after the publication? And if someone is going to be there when the interview ends, what's going to happen? And this isn't an experience only in Colombia, but in other countries. The victim when we spoke with Nadine and many others with whom we've spoken, in one of their interventions, they said, we need to know how our stories are going to be used, who's going to publish, how our information is going to be protected, what's going to happen after this. And that intervention is very, very germane to what happens in Colombia. And I'd like to close by making some recommendations for professionals, interviewers, and researchers. If you can't clearly explain to the survivor how our stories are going to be used, then you might not be ready to interview someone. If you cannot protect the confidentiality in practices, you are putting the survivor's life at risk. If you cannot offer absolute and total control to the victim in managing the interview, the investigation, then you have to be honest with the victim. If you can't do follow-up, say so. I need your interview, but I can't do any follow-up on your case. I can't do any follow-up after the interview. And I'd like to close by saying that for survivors of all genders, honesty also protects us. For us all, respecting what has been built in the Murad Code is not just something technical. It is an ethical decision for a professional, for an interviewer, for the person who wants to gain access to the information. It is a way for us to say about our lives, and that certainly.
Por supuesto, nuestras vidas valen ante cualquier información. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Joel, for sharing the experiences of male survivors of sexual violence, and more generally, for highlighting some of the issues that were raised during the consultations that addressed the profound impact documentators have. They can leave survivors feeling traumatized and powerless, or conversely, they have the ability to help survivors feeling truly seen and heard, as you have explained. Thank you also for highlighting the significance of ethical obligations, informed consent, and honesty when documenters work with survivors. I will now move on to the next speaker, Sabia Husic. Dr. Sabia Husic is a theologian, psychotherapist, and the director of Medica Zenica, the first center in Bosnia-Herzegovina to provide therapy and aid to women who experienced sexual violence during the war. It is one of the 6 organizations that worked with the Murad Code project to facilitate survivors to share their perspectives during the consultation. Sabiha will reflect on what many of the survivors emphasize, that documenters must come prepared with the right knowledge, mindset, and approach before conducting interviews. Sabiha, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes. Please proceed.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the organizers for this important event for survivors and practitioners, and for giving me the opportunity to share some experiences from Medica Zenica and our role in developing the survivor perspective resource. Some sentences about Medica Zenica. Medica Zenica was established in 1993 during the war to support women and children who survived rape and sexualized violence. For more than 3 decades, we have been listening to survivors' voices and responding to their needs. Through this work, we have learned that survivors are the best experts of their own experiences. Survivors often describe that during the violence, they could not fight or flee and experiences the freeze response. They lost their sense of safety, trust, and control over their lives. Unfortunately, many survivors describe similar feelings even today, reinforced by stigma within the family and communities. Survivors describe this by saying, "How can I feel safe? How can I trust people? How can I enjoy my life when I see the perpetrator every day living freely without accountability?" Medica Zenica participated in development of the Survivor Perspectives resource as partner organization of IICI. Our role was to contact survivors within our network, inform them about the opportunity to participate, and support them throughout the entire process. Medica Zenica contacted 25 survivors and fully respected each survivor's decision to participate or not. Those who chose not to participate often explain that they had negative experiences with different interviewers in the past. We fully understood and respected these decisions and informed them that they would be updated once the SPR was published. That is great day today. For survivors who decided to participate, it was very important that consent was understood as ongoing process. This meant that survivors had the right to withdraw from the process at any time, for their own reasons, without any pressure or need for explanation. Our work was guided by stress and trauma sensitive approach. In the resource, that is clearly reflected in the words of one of the survivors we consulted. She must decide who to tell, but bear in mind that she should request a good, comfortable place for herself. Request her rights and be informed about which rights she has, and only when she is informed about her rights and the process, then can make decision whether to go through it and put her needs at the center of everything. Survivors in our network had very different experiences with interacting with journalists, investigators, researchers, and other practitioners. They had positive and negative experiences, and they wanted to share this openly. First, survivors wanted to recognize and highlight good practice. This includes situations in which they felt safe, trusted the process, and retained control over their participation. They emphasize the importance of interviewers asking about their needs and showing respect and understanding. Survivors highlighted how meaningful it was to be allowed to pause, ask for a break, request water or fresh air, or stop the interview just without pressure. This was a common theme highlighted by survivors across the different groups. One Yazidi survivor from Iraq called Nafa Janem Jama described respect in very simple but powerful words. One sign of respect is when I first sit down and am told that I have fully freedom to say what I want or not say. That's one sign of respect I like documenters to have. Second, survivors wanted to speak about harmful practices. This included situations where they felt unsafe, where their experiences were misused, or where they felt treated just as a channel for a story. Some survivors described moments when documenters interrupted them and said, "Okay, I got what I needed," which left them feeling used, disregarded, and emotionally unsupported. Another survivors from DRC articulated this very clearly when she said, "It's not priority to talk to documentaries first. We need care first. We need to invest in services first, receive support like medical, mental support first." Documenters need to make sure that they approach a person who is in the right mind to talk. Assess if they can speak and share, or are they too vulnerable? Some people are just not ready. Do a risk assessment first. In the resource, the quotes shared by survivors clearly underline that survivors' needs must always be at the center of any information gathering process. Survivors emphasize how important it is to have clear information about who can support them, how and where, before, during, and after giving testimony. When this support is present, survivors recognize real care, not just the gathering of information. Some survivors explained that after giving testimony, they were left alone. For some information gatherers, the process ended once the story was collected. For survivors, however, the process often continued. They described feelings of emptiness, emotional exposure, and new worries or dilemmas, and emphasized their need for follow-up support, space to talk, and someone to ask them how they were feeling. This resource brings together survivor voices from different countries and contexts, united by shared experiences of sexualized violence and rape. Through the SPR, survivors expressed solidarity with one another and transformed their difficult experiences into guidance that can improve future practice all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Sabiha, for telling us about the important work of your organization and sharing some of the survivors' perspectives with us today and what they have emphasized, some aspects that they have emphasized as being important to them. Thank you to you, Joel and Nadine, for introducing us to this important resource. You can also explore the interactive microsite version, where you can hear and read some of the quotes shared by survivors. I will now hand over to our next speaker for today, Olivia Head. Olivia Head is the Senior Manager of the Murad Code Project. She has nearly a decade's experience in human rights, transitional justice, and of working with people affected by conflict and forced displacement. As a member of the Murad Code Project team, Olivia has collaborated with survivors and other experts around the world to develop tools and awareness-raising materials that inform survivors of their rights as captured in the Murad Code. She's here today to tell us more about one of these tools. Olivia, please go ahead. You have 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Priya. Oh, just checking you can hear me okay. Great. I think we've got someone who's come off mute, so I'm just gonna, okay, here we go. I'm just going to, perfect. Okay, it's really great to see so many familiar faces on the call today, and it's an honor to share this platform with the speakers who we've just heard from, and also with Elizabeth Atieno, who was one of the survivors who helped to develop the resource that I'm going to introduce to you now. My colleague Marion is sharing her screen so you can see the tool that I'm talking about. It's the Murad Code Rights Tool for survivors. And yeah, we've just heard from the previous speakers why it's so important for those of us who document or gather information about sexual violence for any other reasons to uphold the minimum standards that are in the Murad Code that apply to our work, and what the consequences for survivors and also for the efficacy of our work are when we don't uphold these standards. I'm sure that many of you are on this call today because you are already committed to ethical practice. But there are lots of people out there who are gathering information from survivors who are not aware that the standards that are in the Murad Code exist, or if they are aware, they don't understand how to apply them, or they think they lack the resources or the time or the capacity to do so. And in these situations, survivors cannot rely on the person who is interviewing them to keep them safe, to uphold their rights, or to support them throughout the process of sharing this very personal information and all of the kind of emotional and physical impact that that can have for survivors. So while we were developing, in our own words, the Survivor Perspectives resource that you've just been hearing about, survivors who were involved in the consultations shared that they didn't always know what questions to ask to gauge whether someone who was asking to interview them would respect them and their rights, and they weren't always clear on what they could expect or what they could request from an interviewer. Often survivors said they felt obligated to speak with documenters, or they didn't feel that they could say no, even if they wanted to, because of the power imbalance and the power dynamics that exist. So in response to this feedback, we developed the Murad Code Rights Tool for survivors, which captures the 10 most important things to remember before, during, and after an in-person interview. This is specifically for people who are considering whether to participate in an interview in person. We're also going to be publishing a separate resource for people considering whether to do a remote interview, because lots of similar issues apply, but also different ones in terms of security and other considerations if you're speaking to someone over the internet or another device. So this tool, the Rights Tool for Survivors, was developed in close consultation with a group of survivor experts, and we'll hear more from Elizabeth in a moment. And the goal was really to create a tool that reflected the standards captured in the code in plain, straightforward language, and to ensure the messages could be helpful to survivors in any context who are interacting with any type of interviewer. The result is a neat tool that gives clear information to survivors about what they can expect from an interview and what questions they can ask to assess whether the person who they'll be sitting down with, who will be interviewing them, will respect their rights throughout the process. It's divided into 3 stages: what to remember before you agree to an interview, that in many cases you can say no, that you can take your time to decide, what to remember once you have agreed to an interview, that safety and confidentiality come first, that you can choose where and with whom the interview takes place, and that you can share what you want in your own words. And then what to remember after an interview, that you can ask to review what the person has written and have the right to be informed about how your information is used. The tool has been translated into 7 languages, the same 7 languages as the Survivor Perspectives resource. So that's Arabic, Bosnian, French, Nepali, Spanish, Swahili, and Ukrainian. It's available online, and it can also be printed as a booklet. And I really encourage you to take a look at it and think about how you can use it and share it with others. One of the ideas that we had when we were developing this tool is that if you work with survivors, you could support them by sharing this tool with them when you first reach out, to invite them to participate in a documentation project or in any other information gathering process. We felt that if you provided it early, it would show a commitment to transparency and survivor-centered practice, and give survivors time to review it and think about what questions they have for you before making their decision about whether to speak to you or not. So I will, I think that the links might already be in the chat. Perfect, they are. So yeah, please do take a look, and we really encourage you to share it with your networks. Think about how you can use this tool, and yeah, take it forward in your work. Thank you so much. I'll hand back over to you now.
Thank you very much, Olivia. Let's now turn to our next speaker, Elizabeth Atieno. Elizabeth Atieno is a Kenyan advocate and a member of Synergy for Justice Survivor Expert Roster. Her advocacy work has focused on reparations, survivor inclusion, and issues affecting children born of sexual violence. Elizabeth participated in consultations to develop the Rights Tool for Survivors, and is here to share her perspective on why such a tool is needed and how it can help survivors to prepare for interviews and ensure that their rights are respected during these interactions. Elizabeth, the floor is yours. You have 8 minutes. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much, Priya. Allow me to please take this opportunity to thank IICI for for the opportunity to work with them and to participate in development of this resource. I don't take this opportunity for granted, and I'm really grateful to it because so many times this is never business as usual. So many times survivors are just invited to show up and speak, but there is no meaningful participation. And thank you so much to Synergy for Justice for the connection, because I got this connection through them. So I'm grateful. I am not sharing what I'm sharing today because I'm a coward or because it's an assumption or guesswork, but I'll be sharing what I'll be sharing today because it's a first-hand experience that I've had through my journey, my advocacy journey in the quest for justice. I am speaking to you not only as an advocate, but as a survivor of conflict-related sexual violence and as a mother raising a child born of that same violence. My engagement with justice processes has not been abstract or academic. It has been deeply personal, complex, and often exhausting. 10 things to remember are not an abstract principles. They reflect what survivors repeatedly ask for, but are often ignored: dignity, safety, and agency. For me, this resource is an important because it helps shift the burden. It helps institutions to understand that survivors' engagement is not about survivors being strong enough to participate, but it's about the system being ethical enough to include survivors safely and meaningful. For many survivors, justice spaces are not neutral. They can feel intimidating, confusing, and sometimes re-traumatizing. Even well-intentioned, system often expect survivors to adapt to them, rather than asking how system can adapt to survivors. That gap between intention and dignity is where this resource becomes essential. This resource matters because survivors are too often invited to processes without being properly supported to participate meaningfully. We are asked to share our stories, attend consultations, and engage with institutions, yet without being properly supported to do that. This resource helps shift that dynamic. It recognizes that informed, safe, and voluntary participation is not a courtesy, it is a right. And it acknowledges that ethical engagement requires preparation, clarity, and accountability from institutions, not just resilience from survivor. It also matters because it creates a shared reference point. Survivors, practitioners, and institutions can now point to the same standards and say, this is the standard. That clarity is a powerful, it protects survivors and strengthens accountability. What I deeply appreciate about this resource is that it is not written about survivors. It is written with survivors in mind. A survivor-centered approach means recognizing power imbalances and addressing them intentionally. It means understanding that trauma does not end when violence ends. It continues to shape how survivors experience time, language, authority, and expectation. This resource respects this reality. It avoids logistical language, explains processes clearly, and centers consent, choice, and an outcome. It recognizes that survivors are not statistics group. Our needs differ based on context, gender, disability, caregiving responsibility, religion, social stigma, especially for those of us raising children born of the violation that we went through. This is what trauma-informed design looks like in practice, not as a slogan, but as a commitment. Too often, survivors participation is framed as empowerment, while in reality, it comes at a high cost, emotionally, economically, and socially, and psychologically. This resource challenges that. It does not romanticize survivors' strength or resilience. Instead, it asks institutions to take responsibility for creating conditions whereby participation does not cause them harm. Empowerment is not about asking survivors to give more. It is about ensuring that when
There seems to be some problem with Elizabeth's connection. We will just give it, yes, we will just give it a couple of seconds to see if she's able to reconnect. Hopefully it's temporary. Elizabeth, you are back. You were temporarily frozen, but we can hear you now.
Am I clear now?
Yes, you are. Please continue,
Thank you so much.
Elizabeth. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Importantly, this resource also speaks to accountability. It reminds institutions that inclusion is not simply about inviting survivors' voices into the room. It is about listening, responding, and being transparent about what influences those voices actually have. For survivors, tokenism can be a harmful.
Que le diría el coordinador a Wilson de relevante.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. And if there's someone whose mic is not muted, can you please mute your mic? Please continue, Elizabeth.
For survivors, tokenism can be as harmful as exclusion. This resource helps prevent that by encouraging honest communication, feedback loops, and ethical decision-making. It asks justice actors to reflect on their own practices, not just survivors' behaviors. That shift from extraction to partnership is long overdue. The illustration accompanying the resource are not decorative, they are functional. The illustration accompanying the guide, they help translate complex ideas into accessible visuals, especially for survivors who may face language barriers, literacy challenges, or cognitive overload due to trauma. They soften the entry into difficult materials and make the guide the resource feel less intimidating, more humane, and more approachable. For many survivors, that visual invitation can be the difference between disengaging and feeling able to participate. As I close, let me say this. This guide, this resource is an important step towards more ethical, respectful, and genuine survivor-centered engagement. It does not claim to be perfect, no, but it offers a practical, values-driven framework that institutions can and should be held accountable to. Finally, this resource, if used seriously, the 10 things to remember can help transform survivors' inclusion from risky experience into a respectful, empowering one. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for sharing with us firsthand your experiences as a survivor of CRSV and also a mother of a child born of this crime. Thank you for inviting us to reflect upon so many important questions. How can the system adapt to survivors? How can we address the gap between intention and dignity? Thank you for highlighting the significance of the resource in answering these important questions and in general as a tool to assist survivor-centered engagements. I will now hand over to Marian Volkmann-Brandau, who is going to discuss a resource that the Murad Code Project will publish in the coming weeks. Marian Volkmann-Brandau has more than 25 years experience in human rights, criminal investigations, and transitional justice, mainly in West and Central Africa, and is the deputy co-lead of the Murad Code Project. Over the past few months, Marian has been conducting interviews and research to develop a briefing note that compiles evidence of the different forms of harm that are caused to survivors when information gatherers do not uphold the minimum standards distilled in the Murad Code. Over to Marian to tell you more. Marian, you have 6 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Priya, and thank you to everyone for being here. The research that I worked on answers an important question, and it's one that we got some answer today already. What harm occurs when minimum standards are not upheld, even when intentions are good? As we were saying in the morning event, and also one of the participants texted me, we as documenters, we don't often have the opportunity to hear from survivors. Today is a really special moment, and we have heard from survivors, from professionals working with survivors about the harm they have experienced. But we also wanted to put that in writing. So it's not only something we've heard once, but something we could go back to. So based on a literature review and key informant interviews, including with survivors and including with Elizabeth, who has helped me a lot, this note compiles evidence across the full information cycle. So not only interviews, but also how the interview is recorded, how it is shared, how it is published, framed, and reused. And the findings, as you have heard from Joël, from Sabiha, and from Elizabeth, is that harm is not rare, it's not abstract, and it's not limited to one sector. It shows up in journalism, in justice processes, in research, and even in humanitarian work. So there was 4 types of harms we repeatedly saw. The first one, and clearly probably the most evident, is physical and safety risks. Because when confidentiality fails, as Joël was telling us, risks become immediate. The survivors have described reprisal after their identity was shared, or even just identifying details, including threats, beatings, and forced relocation. Meaning that such a breach in confidentiality is not just an ethical failure, it also creates a direct protection risk for survivors and their families. The second type of harm we identified is psychological and emotional, as we have heard today. Survivors, as they've done today, have described interviews triggering anxiety, flashback, long-lasting distress, especially when the interview is rushed, pressurized, or done without preparation or care. Retelling one story to multiple actors, even when it's done upholding the principle of the Murad Code, is also experienced as exhausting, and the distress often continues well after this interview ends. This is something that I have learned from a survivor who I think is in the audience today, and I'd like to welcome Marianne Levine, who says it so eloquently in one of the videos that is on our website. The third type of harm we have identified is harm that is specifically inflicted by justice and transitional justice institutions. The note really specifically looks at institutional treatment, disbelief, humiliating or insensitive questioning, lack of protective measures, and courtroom dynamics that leave survivors feeling victimized again, sometimes even treated as if they are the person at fault. In some cases, because of the toxic way they were treated, survivors even tried to commit suicide. The note includes examples from international tribunal and domestic system, and notes that recent European case law recognized secondary victimization as a human rights violation and condemned sexist stereotyping in many European countries. The last type of harm identified is stigma, and long-term and intergenerational impact. Stigma can be reinforced or amplified how the information is framed, disclosed, or stripped out of its context, sometimes leading to rejection, loss of trust in institution, and therefore also potential loss of support to survivor who won't go to the very institution we're supposed to help them. The note also warns about asking survivors to go into too much details. It could be weaponized in courts later as supposed inconsistencies, but even a media article that contains too many details can have a negative impact even years later. I've talked to a woman born out of rape who found out about her mother's story through a press article which contained personal details of her family. And understandably, this article changed her life. So what can we do? As you've heard today, we can start, and you're doing today, we can start by listening carefully to survivors and taking their testimonies seriously and as guidance for our work. We can read the survivor's perspective in full, and we can keep returning to it as a reference point for what survivor-centered engagements look like in reality. We can read or reread the Murad Code and treat it as a practical tool for our everyday work. Most importantly, before engaging a survivor, we should pose and ask us an honest question. Is it really necessary to interview this person? Or can the purpose be achieved without placing yet another demand on them? If the interview is necessary, we should commit to survivor-centered, trauma-informed practice as a matter of right and accountability. And of course, we should share the resource 10 Things to Remember with the survivor so that they can really make informed choices. Basically, we need to move beyond the narrow approach of do no harm and actively promote survivors' rights and well-being at every stage of how the information is gathered and used. And this is why the 3 resources launched today, so the survivor's perspective, survivor's right, and the evidence of the harms are 3 parts of the same accountability conversation that we are having. Thank you.
Thank you, Marianne, and thank you to all our speakers for their presentations today. We now turn to the final part of our session. I will now open the floor to questions from the audience. As a reminder, please raise your hands if you have a question, and we will invite you to come off mute. So the floor is open for questions.
See, we've got a hand up and more.
I am just looking to see. Yes, I have located Anne. Anne, please proceed.
Thank you very much for the presentations today. My name is Anne Moore. I'm from the Guttmacher Institute. And my question was about the importance placed on making sure that the individual engaging with survivors is themselves a survivor. I haven't heard that mentioned today, and I was curious to hear the perspectives of from the speakers on the value that they place on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you for your question, Anne. I will open the question to speakers to respond.
I don't mind coming in.
Go ahead, Nadine.
Thank you. I mean, I think this is a very good question. I mean, certainly in my work that I do at Freedom from Torture, we do have a directorate called Survivor Leadership and Influencing. As a person who have received services myself, I've seen the difference when we do have initiatives that are led by survivors. Certainly, I was inspired myself to join activism because I saw a survivor leading the work. But that doesn't mean that people who are not survivor don't play that role. The objective is often to have someone who people can relate to, and I think that there is something about being inspired by somebody who has gone through the experiences. But it doesn't mean that if somebody is not a survivor, they can't do the job. We have about 3 different networks, and the comment that we often hear is that people want to see the activism work be led by a lived experience. This is very crucial that people can relate with the person and understand that the experience is also something that they've been through. So it's a yes and no, but there is a lot of benefit in having somebody who has lived the experience. Okay.
Thank you very much, Nadine. I'll now turn to the second question. I have on my screen M1199. If you could please introduce yourself and ask your question. Thank you.
Yes, I'm from Argentina and I'm a survivor of 2 clandestine detention centers in the 70s, but I'm also a journalist and a documenter, and I wrote a book, Horse and Guerrilla Fighters, about sexual violence, and I interview many of my comrades that have been victims of sexual violence. And my question is for Joel from Colombia, and I'll go forward in Spanish. Hola.
How extensive is sexual violence against males? In my country, we know that there were cases, many more cases than were ever reported. You're left with fingers on your head. I understand the stigma, the cultural barriers, but what is your understanding of what the obstacles are for providing testimony on the part of males, and how could this be facilitated from the standpoint of documenters or interviewers? Well, figures first, 98% of victims in Colombia are women. Until 2020 or 2022, the last records were at around 3,000 males victims of sexual violence within the framework of armed conflict. Heterosexual males and some 600 or more diverse gay or bisexual. What happens? I've said it not only in Colombia, but also here. Unfortunately, and I hope that with the interpretation you can be as careful in interpretation from what I'm going to say. I don't want to generate any kind of discord or issues. I simply would like to say that Unfortunately, sexual violence has not been dealt with in Colombia until now in the Special Jurisdiction for Peace. It's the office of the prosecutor in this system. This has not been approached from a wider gender focus. Feminization of sexual violence in Colombia has contributed to under-recording sexual violence against males. There's an exercise, as I said during my intervention, of not conceiving of how a man is violated by another man, if we're on equal footing, that is, quote. And the exercise of feminization, of believing that only females, although the majority of the burden of sexual violence has been in our country women, no space had been given to men, or had they been seen to speak. Women already have a path beaten forward to demand their rights for women who are victims of sexual violence and LGBTQI plus populations. When we submitted a report to the commission, maybe those of you who have been able to read the story about Colombia, a commission, a truth commission was created at the end in order to provide a final report, to provide recommendations to the Colombian government. Started off from reports from Colombian society. That is, the final report of that Truth Commission only names only says the word males or men 32 times in the chapter on sexual violence. That is, the feminization that was given to that report. For example, those of us who expected more from the commission were saying, hey, wait a minute, the focus, and even with the presentation of men in the special jurisdiction of peace, we don't want a feminist focus on the report. We want a report that focuses on rights. That is, the focus on rights opens the door for space for men and women, obviously acknowledging that there are differences vis-a-vis the demands, consequences, and impacts from sexual violence in women and men. But those of us who are working today on sexual violence against males are willing to be agents, and we've done so through our experience of being agents for prevention, and that's as far.
Excelente, excelente. Muchas gracias. Many thanks.
Thank you very much, Joel. I am taking a look to see if there are any other questions, and I don't see any hands up. Olivia, is that correct?
I can see Marian's got her hand up.
Oh, yes.
Oh, yeah.
I'm so sorry. I was looking for a way to raise my hand and nothing was coming up. My apologies. I'll keep this brief. Just a huge thank you to all the speakers. I'm Ruby Mishenska. I'm a safeguarding consultant working on these issues within the NGO sector. The question I had, and this has come up from hearing the different speakers, the balance, I suppose, between enabling survivors' voices to be heard and not making an assumption that they would not want to speak or would not be able to speak, versus, I think, Marian, you were saying later, not necessarily going immediately to a survivor if you can get information in other places. I'd really welcome everyone's thoughts or any speaker's thoughts on how to get that balance right. So not to assume that someone wouldn't want to speak, but also not to force them to. And I would welcome thoughts on that. Thank you.
Can she kindly repeat the question again, please?
Ruby, would you mind repeating the question?
No, of
Please.
course. So my question was just around, so I think we've heard some speakers, quite rightly say that we shouldn't assume any sort of view or belief on the part of survivors, and that many people will want to speak, and actually an assumption that they might not want to speak is kind of silencing or disempowering. And then perhaps on the other side, we're also hearing that we shouldn't perhaps immediately go to survivors if we can access information elsewhere, in case doing so is re-traumatizing or distressing. And just on a kind of practical level, I would welcome everyone's insights on how to balance that in a way which listens to people, is not making assumptions, and is doing this work ethically and safely.
I will give the floor to survivors in a minute, but also because we have so many amazing activists here on the call, Miriam Lewin, Joelle, Elizabeth, Nadine, I think it's also striking the balance is also not asking them over and over again about what happened to them, but what they've become, about their fight, their pathway. And you see how rich they've created organization, they've written books, I think you can go to them to talk about their strengths and their fight and their and not to have to ask them all over about the past, but rather how they've managed to turn that into a strength. I stop here and I leave the survivors respond to you.
Thank you, Marian. I see that Joel has his hand up. Did you want to give a response, Joel? Please go ahead.
Sí, yo quería responder aquí a la compañera Ruby, que hizo la pregunta, y creo que va en el marco de lo que planteé, por supuesto. Es sencillo en el acuerdo de paz, por ejemplo, en Colombia habla de centralidad de las víctimas. El Código Murad, por ejemplo, habla de un enfoque centrado en las víctimas. Es la respuesta clara a eso. ¿Cuál es la fuente más confiable y viable del poder un profesional acceder a la información? Por supuesto que la víctima. Pero ¿cómo? ¿Y cómo hacemos el equilibrio? Fácil, con un enfoque centrado en la víctima. Es decir, desde la perspectiva y desde cómo la víctima quiera entregar la información. Es simplemente sencillo, con un enfoque centrado en las víctimas.
Can I jump in, please?
Yes, please go
Priya?
ahead. Thank you, Joel. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I just want to mention that in the 10 things to remember, it is very clear on how you should engage with the survivor. And as a profession, I want to believe that there is a way you can get information from a survivor without asking them to repeat themselves all over again. As a profession, I believe there is a way to do that, and the 10 things to remember is just giving dignity to survivors, because I always say, I tell people so many times when I share my story that my dignity was taken away from me, and over the years, part of my journey and my fight has been to restore it, not just to myself, but to other survivors as well. And dignity is when you come to me and see me not just a survivor, but as an expert as well, as a profession in my own field, as a profession who has walked that journey and who has first experience. I might not have gone to school and do some thesis and be a candidate of a PhD, but as a profession who has gone to the school of life, who has seen it all, who has been there and has come out of it strong. And you can sit down with me and we can talk and interact. And I'm telling you, at the end of the day, you will have more information that you needed in that way than the other way if I was just to narrate my story and that's it. When you come to survivors and You see them as human beings, as people who have lived, people who have gone through things that they've come out strongly with, full of resilience. It does something to us survivors. It does something to us. It does something to me. It just doesn't make me feel like something that life erased, but it restores something to me when you sit with me. For instance, you ask me about justice, how I view justice, about what can be changed in the justice system. I think to me that can really do so much good to me than making me narrate my story. We are not saying, and if a survivor wants to narrate their story, we don't say that survivors should not narrate their stories. No. All we are saying is to give survivors options to speak for themselves, to share their story in a different way. I don't know if I've answered the question or I've helped answering the question, but I believe I've answered the question. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. I too believe that you have answered the question. Thank you. And I'm going to turn to some of the other speakers who have their hands up. I'll start with Nadine, since your hand went up first, and then I'll turn to Joel. So Nadine, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Priya. So I'm going to speak from a survivor perspective, but also as a facilitator, how easy it is to limit engagement to only speaking. I mean, the example that we have here today is we do have a lot of contributor to the different resources, but only some of us are here speaking. I think we need to learn to really step back. And I've heard so many people saying it differently today, how survivors are expert. And we often fail to recognize that expertise, that is not always about being the face, the one being, holding the microphone and the one, speaking. There are so many people who have contributed to this work, but they are not speaking. And when we are able to come with a blank page and ask that question, how would you like to engage? And really allow people, as I facilitated things myself, I can tell you quite often I've already had an idea in mind, and I had to remind myself that I'm not here to prescribe how these things is going to work, but I have to step back, even allow my colleagues, survivor, to say, you know what, we want to engage this way. And I think that we can be more powerful and more effective when we really trust the process. We often say trust the process, but it's not as easy, as that. And what also we don't often do is we don't prescribe a protocol. You have an idea in mind, you want to engage with survivor, but have you established a protocol of the way you are going to engage with people? Have you done the right research to find out what is needed and how, what are the things that you need to take into account to engage with survivor? So really trusting people and asking the right question from inside and making sure that people can maintain that agency throughout the process. Ask you questions as well. You need to let people know that they have the right to ask you questions and stop you. And sometimes you can come up with an idea, but also people tell you something else, because often we already know what we have. But we have to allow people to also input into the process and say, you know what, rather than doing it the way you want it to do that to be done, our idea is to rather do this instead. So really allowing that agency to really to be, demonstrated throughout the process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nadine. And Joel, you now have the floor.
Sí, no, simplemente.
You're right. I simply wanted to make a very brief comment, a call to survivors as well, to tell you all that do not allow anyone to manage the situation. We are free to decide when we want to talk. I understand that contexts are totally different, that there are more violent conflicts in other countries where victims cannot publicly speak. We understand that. But this is also a call for those who come from other countries to perform projects in countries such as in Latin America or in other countries where victims can speak on their own. They simply require accompaniment and support from you, such to allow them to become empowered and to properly represent themselves, and to ask the victims, are you sure? Do you want to talk? Or we can also offer you a possibility. The victim decides, that it be the survivor who decides above anybody else. The survivor has control of their own narrative. We are the ones who decide when and how and where we want to talk.
Thank you so much for that, Joel. I don't see any hands up for any more questions. And I would really like to thank the participants as well for engaging in the Q&A, for facilitating this rich discussion with all our speakers. And let me also pass on a huge thank you to all our speakers, particularly to the survivor experts for sharing their insights with us today. We would also like to thank all the survivors who contributed to the Murad Code project to develop these resources. Please do take these resources forward in your work, share them with your network, and keep an eye on the Murad Code project website over the next couple of months as more tools will be published. Thank you for your attention and participation, and I will now close the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you so much.